You are all set.
Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our July webinar event. I know it is the summer, so I'm happy to see so many of you here today. My name is Devin Ramey and I am a lecturer in behavior analysis here at Queen's University, Belfast. And on behalf of the Center for Behavior Analysis, I am honored to introduce to you our speaker today, Dr. Russell Lang. Russ is a doctoral level board certified behavior analyst and a professor of special education at Texas State University. He also serves as the executive director of the Clinic for Autism Research, Evaluation, and Support. Russ is currently an associate editor for Advances in Neurodevelopmental Disorders and is on the editorial boards for 12 other peer-reviewed journals. Russ has published 4 books and over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters. For his research contributions, he has been presented several awards, including the Presidential Award for Excellence in Scholarly Activities from Texas State University and the Distinguished Peer Review Award from Elsevier Publishing. Last year, Russ was invited to present a TEDx talk on evidence-based practice and pseudoscience. His talk, Deception, Magical Thinking, and Pseudoscience in Autism, can be viewed now on YouTube. On a more personal note, Russ was one of my mentors and one of my favorite professors at Texas State University when I was completing my master's. During my time in the CARES clinic, Russ inspired me to become more involved in the research field. He also encouraged me to pursue my PhD, and I safely could say that I would not be here today if it weren't for his guidance and support. I have learned a lot from him over the years, so I'm confident that we will all learn something new today. So I'm very excited to get started, but before we do, I just wanted to cover some general housekeeping issues. There will be 4 attendance checks throughout the presentation, and you must click that you are here for at least 3 of the 4 checks in order to receive your CEU. However, please do not worry if you do miss any checks or if you have any technical issues. If you do have any issues, you can always contact support at Behavior Live or click on the help button at the bottom of your screen. You can also contact Chris at the end of the presentation and he will sort you out with your CEUs. So please do not stress about this and just enjoy the content for now. Another quick reminder is regarding questions. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a button for questions. You can click on this button to submit a question directly to Russ. I will try to monitor the chat, but to ensure that I don't miss anything, it is best to use this feature to ask any questions that you would like for the Q&A. Russ will respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Dr. Russell Lang.
Thanks, Devin. That was very kind. One of the best students I ever had while we're at it. So thank you guys for inviting me and letting me share some thoughts with you on play and children with autism. I've jammed this thing full of stuff I want to share. And this is a bit ambitious for an hour. I realize that, but hopefully we can get through it and still have plenty of time to address those questions. I really want to just give a brief overview of play and its role in child development. It won't take long there. And then a brief overview for how play seems to differ from the trajectory we see in typical childhood development when we talk about children with autism. And then there's sort of a small research line here that we've been working on for a couple years. And it begins with 2 systematic literature reviews and then 2 small single case design studies that we're going to sort of tie in together with some cautious recommendations for practitioners at the end. So just to jump right into it. Play is the business of childhood. I used to think that quote came from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. It was like a TV show host for kids when I was a kid. But it turns out it's from Jerome Brunner, who's a well-known psychologist in learning theory. But actually, the fact that I was confused as to where the quotation came from underscores my point, which is that play has largely been considered foundational. What's going on here? But that does sort of underscore my point for this slide anyway, which is that play is largely foundational to healthy child development. So researchers across the fields of developmental psychology, behavior analysis, and education have really been talking about play and the context it provides for learning and practicing skills for a long time. whether it's physical skills, motor skills, or social, intellectual, emotional functioning. There's skills there's opportunities within play to practice and pick these types of things up. So just for example, imagine a child sort of laying in their crib with the mobile above them with the hanging stuff on it. In order to be able to reach up and bat at that mobile and enjoy the sort of potentially reinforcing consequences of the things moving around and the music coming out of it, there's hand-eye coordination. You have to be able to make your arm go where the stuff is and make contact. From the very early stages of object manipulation, from the crib to being able to crawl and then explore the environment, we're practicing these types of things. This child here in the picture, in order to be able to stack the blocks, they've got to solve some sort of problem related to balance and positioning and the rest to be able to achieve this outcome. As behavior analysts, at least in my experience, we don't spend a lot of time talking about typical child development and developmental trajectories, right? There are many examples of play behavior and several different taxonomies used to classify or distinguish between various types of play behavior. So some friends and I made this sort of simplified, perhaps oversimplified chart that blends several of the more common terms used to describe specific types of play. And then we arrange them according to the time of life that specific form of play is usually expected to emerge. So from between birth and 6 months of age, we see this sort of sensory motor and exploratory type play. We all know and we've all heard about the importance of an enriched environment, particularly in early childhood. But when you think about it, in order to benefit from an enriched, stimulating environment, a child has to explore and actually interact with that environment, touching, feeling, tasting, and whatnot as they move around their world. As children approach their first birthday, we expect to see the emergence of functional play skills. And in functional play, a child imitates the behavior of others, usually parents, siblings, that sort of thing. And then they're reinforced with some sort of social interaction. So you might imagine a child feeding a baby doll a bottle like they saw dad do, or a child hammering with one of those toy hammers on the block things and pushing the pegs through like they saw a parent do. And in that way, they learn they have the potential to learn the sort of functional use of objects and to practice observing and imitating the people around them. Between the first and second year, we expect to see something that I've collapsed several forms of play from a variety of different literature bases here. And we expect to see symbolic or imaginative, pretend or dramatic play, that type of thing. In symbolic play, you might pretend that one object is a different sort of object. So you grab your hairbrush and sing "Girls Just Want to Have Fun" into your microphone, or you grab the broomstick and it becomes a horse. Or it can even be more imaginative, where no object represents the thing you're pretending is there, and the dragon that isn't chases you around the backyard or something. Dramatic play, you take on a role that isn't your own, pretending to be a pirate or a princess or a knight or something. And children are able to use these types of play. They practice constructing narratives and taking the perspective of others. And it facilitates the understanding of relationship between items and between people. No matter how we look at it, there are going to be opportunities in play. We know that observation and imitation are important in their own right when it comes to learning additional skills. In play, we have a chance to condition social interactions with play partners to be reinforcing, right? By playing with somebody and enjoying the activity, we in some ways create a reinforcing context for that person and start to value their social interaction as a reinforcer more. And it gives us a chance to practice social problem solving skills. I have an 8-year-old daughter who's my favorite play partner, and occasionally she's upset with the way that I might render her snuggle friend. That's what we call stuffed animals or little plush animal things. Like, yeah, that's not Pinky's personality, Dad. That Pinky's kind of, sassy, and I have to take on a different personalities with the different friends as I play with it. And those types of problem solving and managing expectations and turn-taking level social skills, if you're going to play successfully and you enjoy playing, then you get good at these types of things as you go through it. Unfortunately, children with autism don't seem to develop play in the same way as we see in typical developing children. Leo Kanner first describes a small group of children with autism. One of the most salient things in that early paper is his description of the differences in play. He noted that that the children in the small sample were arranging toys in a straight line. They were repetitiously counting the toys. They seemed to be preoccupied with small parts of toys and had a strict adherence to routines within their play structures, right? Said in a kind of a different way more recently, Bruckner and Yoder in 2007 put it this way: there seems to be an increase in the use of the attentional spotlight and a decrease in the use of the attentional searchlight. So to put that another way, they're focusing in on one small aspect, like you can see the child here spinning the wheel on the truck, as opposed to considering the truck as a truck or as a whole toy and perhaps playing with it in a way that might be more expected, right? That focus in on that small piece would be the attentional spotlight. And it seems to come at the expense of paying attention to a larger, wider variety of toys. So again, thinking about your enriched environment and your stimulating things that you want to do, is particularly in early childhood. If children aren't actually sampling that, aren't actually experiencing the variety that's available to them, we lose some of that power from those early environments. So that's, I said it would be quick. That was a quick overview of some play development and some notes as to how children with autism tend to differ on average from that typical development. So that begs the question, that's great and all, but play is just play, right? Should we really be teaching play skills? So several researchers have noted many potential benefits to teaching play skills. For example, if you are engaged in play that looks like the play of other children, you may be more likely to be approached by other children. Oh, hey, he's got that cool new dump truck. I want to play with that. And perhaps that occasions a social opportunity. Similarly, you may be more likely to be included in general educational settings or less restrictive educational settings. Children who are engaged in play that looks like the play of typical children don't stick out as much and may not draw the attention of the kinds of people who would move their educational placement. You would imagine the more different you look from your peers, the higher the probability are that you might get a more restrictive setting, for better or worse. There seems to be some increased exposure to language related to play actions. So I imagine a child playing with a toy barn set or something, and a teacher walks by and says, oh, I see you've got the toy cow and the farmer's milking the cow or whatever. That kind of commentary on their play behavior is less likely if instead of recognizable play, the child is engaged in some sort of stereotypy or self-stimulatory behavior. You may be less likely to engage in stereotypy and more likely to engage in social behavior if you have the play skills, right? It's unlikely that other children on the playground are going to want to come over and flap and rock or engage in some other type of stereotypy. And it seems to be an increased probability that if you're doing something that looks fun, some game they understand, then those children may in fact be more likely to approach. These things persist over time, and we often see adults, particularly with more moderate to severe levels of disability, they may be more likely to struggle with leisure activities. We know that leisure skills in adulthood are part of how we cope with stressful situations, how we recover from difficult life events. I don't know how I would have made it through 2020 if I didn't have a robust leisure skills repertoire, for example, right? So there's some speculated, potentially, and in some cases demonstrated at least tentatively, benefits to improving play skills. Which brings us to perhaps the first important question here. Can we teach play skills? So this is an older review. We did it back in 2009. We found 15 studies. We attempted to find every study we could that targeted either functional or symbolic play for children in early childhood with autism. So 0 to 8 years old with, at the time, you could have been diagnosed with autism or Asperger's syndrome. And we took a look at those 15 studies. We did all the usual things, collated and summarized and analyzed that data in a chunk. And we identified these 3 treatment packages or intervention packages that seemed to be really common when it came to improving play skills. Video modeling with some contingent reinforcement, a video of a child playing some way, then the child with autism observes the video, gives access to the same set of toys, and then is reinforced for any imitation of the play behavior seen in the video. Activity schedules have been used, or at least were used kind of relatively commonly in 2009 for play skills. This is sort of like teaching play as a series of steps, right? So maybe you might say the first activity is stacking the block and then putting the man on top of the block and knocking him off, or whatever the case may be, right? A sequence of activities explained in pictures or in some other way within an activity schedule. And then the larger, more comprehensive intervention packages like enhanced familiar teaching, natural language paradigm, pivotal response training, those types of things have also been associated with and used quite frequently to teach play behaviors. Of course, they're teaching a large number of behaviors at the same time, but their effects specifically on play have been measured in a number of studies. Looking at these intervention packages and pulling them apart to see what the components are, what's really being done inside of each one of these intervention packages, and what do they have in common. Across all the 15 interventions, we saw a lot of modeling. Sometimes that modeling was in person, in vivo, and sometimes it was on video. But showing children how to play by doing it and having them observe was a common approach. When observation and imitation alone didn't seem to be effective, there's a lot of systematic prompting, the stuff you'd expect. Verbal, gesture, go like this, make the man jump, or whatever. Of course, if you're going to improve a behavior, increase a behavior in any way, you're going to need reinforcement. The most common type of reinforcement used in play behavior was praise and continued play, access to an additional part of the toy, or some sort of ongoing access to the game. And, hey, I really like the way you made the bear eat the cookie or something. That kind of play behavior specific praise was pretty common. And I think this part is great in particular. The majority of play interventions in this review were done in naturalistic, natural environment type settings. And even more so naturalistic, following the child's lead as opposed to being prescriptive. Instead of saying, I'm going to teach you how to play this race car game, it was more putting the child into the room and seeing what kinds of activities they gravitated towards, and then following the child down that path and playing with those items and embedding the play instruction where their interests seem to lie. That type of naturalistic instruction being particularly associated with natural language paradigm and enhanced milieu teaching, of course. But long story short, we concluded, yeah, sure, we can improve play behavior. Well, this was back in 2009, close to when I had graduated my PhD program, and I came across an article that really questioned whether or not behavior analysts were really teaching play. Is that genuine play? And I'll get back to that because I think that's pretty important. So I want you to hold that thought in your mind. We can improve what we call play behaviors, but are those play behaviors genuine play? Before I get to that point again, I want to cover the second of the 2 lit reviews here. If play is just about improving play, it may be worth doing, but it may be more worth doing and more important of a dependent variable, the kind of thing we should focus on in our interventions a little bit more, if there's additional benefits beyond the improvement of play skills. So we had those assertions by previous researchers and some demonstrations of the kinds of things that are assumed to happen if you improve your play skills. You may have more social interactions, more language opportunities, that kind of thing. Well, we wanted to take a closer look at that. So about 7 or 8 years since our first review, we picked it back up and we found all the studies that did, where it is. All right, we screened 710 studies and we found 46 that involved children between 0 and 8 years old with autism that received a focused intervention. So I don't mean an intervention that looked at everything, like an early intervention, early intensive behavioral intervention would be comprehensive. A focused intervention would teach just one skill type at a time. And so we were looking for focused interventions focused on play. And we wanted to target a play behavior and also measure some sort of collateral behavior change. A collateral behavior change is a behavior change that occurs as the result of an intervention, without a clear mechanism of action in the intervention that should have produced it. In other words, it's a change in a behavior, but that behavior wasn't directly targeted by any intervention component, right? We didn't reinforce it, we didn't prompt it, but yet it seemed to emerge as a result of the intervention. So that's what we were looking for. We screened a ton of studies and we found 46 that had these characteristics. We did all the stuff you're supposed to do in a good systematic review. I hate to say this, but take my word for it. You can check the citation here, but I don't want to get into the methodological meat on these reviews any. But we did this stuff. Here were the key findings, and isolated looking at just play. Interventions that directly targeted play skills have resulted in untargeted improvements in language. So that assertion is clear within this body of research. And we found that multiple studies, multiple ways that improving play behavior seems to increase language in some important way. We also found that interventions designed to reduce stereotypy, so the target is on stereotypy, seem to have resulted in untargeted, unintended improvements in play skills. So if we decrease hand flapping, the child, instead of hand flapping, is likely to produce a more recognizable type of play, some sort of functional play, appropriate play, however you want to put it. It also seemed to work the other way. Interventions to improve play skills seem to result in untargeted reductions in stereotypy. I think that's pretty important when you think about how difficult stereotypy can be to treat and the other types of treatment options we might have for reducing stereotypy. But it wasn't just that. Interventions designed to improve play also have resulted in improved eye contact, improved joint attention, and just in general, reduced impediments to social interaction. So learning to play seems to reduce challenging behavior in some cases. It seems to reduce the types of stereotypy that would potentially preclude other children from wanting to play with you, and those kinds of things. So we are in fact seeing that play isn't just for play's sake, that play does seem to sort of have a ripple effect across other important domains of functioning in early childhood. So back to this idea of stereotypy. That was one of the more intriguing things we found in this collateral behavior change review. Stereotypy seems to have a lot of things in common with play. Stereotypy is often, not always, often maintained by automatic reinforcement. And it's a common assertion that genuine play, whatever that means, that genuine play is also maintained by some sort of automatic or intrinsic, if you will, reinforcement. Stereotypy tends to occur during times when we would expect typical play to occur. When, you know, left to free time on the playground during recess or something, or left alone in a room full of toys, children with autism are more likely to engage in stereotypic behavior and less likely to engage in play behavior. When we look at what we have to do to decrease stereotypy, if that's a treatment goal, it's not easy stuff. Patterson et al. And Lanavos et al. Have provided some great reviews on the treatment of stereotypy, and these things seem to rise to the surface. Some sort of differential reinforcement approach, wherein, you know, the absence of stereotypy is reinforced, or some other behavior is reinforced in place of stereotypy. Then match stimulation. Match stimulation might be the coolest in my opinion, but probably the hardest to do. The idea in match stimulation is I'm going to figure out what the sensory or automatic reinforcing property of the stereotypy is. So if I'm rocking back and forth, maybe it's that motion. If I'm pushing on my eyes, maybe there's a visual sort of stimulation there. Making the repetitive vowel sound and that vocal stereotypy that we hear often is perhaps related to the sound itself being reinforcing, or some sort of vibration on the throat or the chest. If you can figure out what that thing is in some reliable way, and then find another way for the child to access that sensation, you may end up displacing stereotypy in a manner similar to how you might expect to replace challenging behavior in FCT. And then finally, this might be the more common of the approaches with response interruption and redirection. Simply, I'm going to interrupt physically your stereotypic behavior and redirect it towards play behavior or something else, and then reinforce that behavior when it occurs. I don't know if you've ever tried that, but interrupting stereotypic behavior can result in aggression, crying, and a variety of things that seem to have functioned to escape from the intervention as to trying to prevent them from engaging in stereotypy. So you can imagine that if stereotypy is displacing play, and you were to try to use one of these interventions, you quickly get out of the kind of context that's likely to produce play behavior. If I'm stopping you from doing what you're doing and you're mad about that, if the very next thing I try to do is teach you how to play, there may be some resistance to this that's going to be difficult in the intervention to overcome. Stereotypy is tough. It can be argued, though, that perhaps we shouldn't be treating stereotypy in as many children as we do. That stereotypy is a form of play for children with autism, and maybe we should respect that more. And I think there's some truth that needs to be considered there. But nonetheless, there are cases where stereotypy is a viable target behavior. So bringing it back to the guy who's questioning, is the play taught through behavioral interventions genuine play? He put it this way. I love this. Do behavioral approaches teach children with autism to play, or are they pretending? In other words, if I use an activity schedule to teach you how to build a Lego house, have I taught you to play with Legos, or have I simply taught you to follow a sequence of steps to get a reinforcer that is not normally associated with play behavior? Some sort of contrived reinforcer that wouldn't normally be provided in the natural environment. Yes, the argument goes, you've made this child's behavior look more like play, but if you define play in the way that it was done in this article critical of behavioral approaches, if you define play as internally motivated, flexible, spontaneous, and voluntary, then you might also conclude that these are quotes, not my opinion of the behavioral research, but I'm quoting this article. They see that behavioral interventions for play are heavily structured, repetitive, and reliant on the use of external reinforcers. Obviously, I don't like the term internally motivated or external reinforcers, but I read external reinforcers to mean socially mediated reinforcers. Those reinforcers that come from another person, as opposed to the class of reinforcers that might be associated with automatic reinforcement, wherein the contingency is within one's self, right? I'm doing it because it feels good to me in some way or alleviates pain in some way, that kind of thing. Nonetheless, this group took a look at 34 behavioral play interventions and concluded that most of those interventions did not meet their definition of genuine play. There was an insufficient measure of play quality. In other words, the children didn't have any measure of whether or not they were actually happy, engaged, in a good mood, those kinds of correlates that we might expect to see or expect for the child to experience when engaged in play. They noted that generalization was rarely measured and that there wasn't a mechanism responsible or discussed about how play could be more flexible or spontaneous within our literature base at this time. It was a while back, but at this time. And they made the very astute point that stuck with me, that play interventions from a behavioral perspective often tend to ignore the developmental literature. They're not paying as much attention to that sequence of play taxonomy kinds of behaviors that are emerging at various points of life and considering the child's level and teaching play at a developmentally appropriate level. It's done, but not done nearly as much as perhaps it should be, and not done enough to make the sort of claims that were being made in some of the articles, or so the argument went. Finally, that there was rare or a weak demonstration of play in the absence of external reinforcers. And the authors of this review concluded that therefore play does not appear to be, the play resulting from behavioral interventions does not appear to be voluntary or internally motivated in an important way. In other words, if the discriminative stimuli for the reinforcer that's likely to be contingent upon play behavior is removed, if the people that would provide the reinforcer aren't there, then how do we know that play would continue? If we leave the room and the child stops building the Lego house and goes back to waving the Lego in front of their face, did we teach them play, or did we just displace stereotypy for the sake of the socially mediated reinforcer at that time? Overall, they concluded that the body of literature simply did not measure up to the claims being made by behaviorists regarding the ability to teach play. So that set the stage for the first intervention study. It took me a couple years to get around to it, to say the least, but this is the intervention study that we ran to address those concerns. So the study had several aims. First, I wanted to go back and look for and try to demonstrate clearly this connection between stereotypy and play skills. I wanted to see if we could intentionally reduce stereotypy through play skills intervention. We wanted to evaluate those concerns regarding behavioral approaches to improve genuine play. And so we needed to find a way to look at this idea of being internally motivated, flexible, spontaneous, and voluntary. So I translated that from that article to mean that play should occur across context and it should vary in form. In other words, we need both response and stimulus generalization. So in this study, we measured generalization of play behaviors taught through behavioral interventions across toys. So we used one toy in intervention and we looked at other toys for generalization. We did the same thing with settings. And we assessed the play following intervention in the absence of all signals of potential reinforcement. Right, we wanted to see if play would be maintained when the child couldn't have reasonably expected to be externally reinforced, to have reinforcement socially mediated, right? No attention, no tangibles, no other thing but the automatic reinforcement presumably available from play should be sufficient to maintain the play behavior. And then finally, what about this playful disposition, that children should feel happy and content or joyful in a way when engaged in play? It's tough for behavior analysts to talk about emotions. We can't see them very clearly, but we can do some things that get at that. Actually, Devin and her colleague, Dr. Healy, have done some work on looking at mood as a behavioral indicator and that kind of thing. So how can we get at this idea of playful disposition within the context of play? All right, so to answer these questions, to pursue these aims, we had 3 children with autism who were attending an early child care setting. We did this in their normal early child care facility. The children were 42, 46 months, 3-4 years, somewhere in there, 4 years plus. And in observation of them in their typical environment, we in fact did see little to no recognizable functional play skills. We asked parents about the types of play they saw at home to sort of confirm those results across settings. And children were included when there was genuine concerns about their play behavior across both environments. The children had some words, 1 to 2 word utterances, maybe 10 to 20 word vocabularies, that kind of thing, to give you an idea of severity. When we did observe them with toys in their natural school environment, in this early child care setting environment, what we saw them do was the very classic sort of stereotypy, waving the toy in front of their face, repetitive opening and closing of hinges on like toy car doors or barn doors or something. And then the classic arranging toys in a straight line and touching each one. So the children were interacting with toys. They were doing a high probability activity, and they seemed reasonably content doing it. But these things don't meet the definition of genuine play or fall cleanly into the taxonomy of types of play that has been identified in the developmental literature. So these guys were included. First 3 that met these criteria were included. So this isn't the early child care setting because I didn't want to include a picture of that. But this is an early child care setting that looks almost identical to the one we were in. And all sessions were conducted in this sort of environment. There was a mix of kids with developmental and intellectual disabilities and a mix with alongside typical developing children. Sort of a reverse inclusion model, though, because there tended to be more children with developmental and intellectual disabilities in this classroom than otherwise. But still, a chaotic early child care setting, like they all are. And we did it in center time. I don't know if they have center time or maybe they call it something different, sort of a circle time, where you might have 4 or 5 activities set up around the classroom, and in either individually or in small groups, the children spend 5 to 10 minutes and then they rotate to the next center, and they may do puzzles, then rotate the next center, and they might do some sort of drawing activity or whatever. And then there's a center. The way this classroom was set up, you would eventually rotate to the center with the teacher in it, and the teacher would work on some little skill with the child for 5-10 minutes, and then that child would rotate out. And so in this way, the teacher got 5 to 10 minutes of individual time with each child as they moved around the center time. we embedded, that was an existing routine before we got there as researchers, but it seemed the perfect place to put a play skills intervention. So simply as the child would move from center to center, the participant would eventually land in front of the teacher's center, and they would implement the intervention in that context. We did a baseline in a different room than we did intervention, and I'll show you that when I show you the graph in just a second. We picked toys that the children had no previous learning experience with, right? These are toys the children had never seen before. We did that by talking to both teachers and parents and ensuring that both this was an appropriate toy by both stakeholder standards, and also that neither the teacher nor the parent had any reason to believe the child had ever seen these toys before. We didn't want any learning history with any of these items. And then we taught the existing teacher, of course, to do the intervention in the context of this center time. We did that in the usual way, and we considered it sufficient when the teacher got above 80% treatment fidelity. Here are the actual toys. Well, this is 2 of the 4 sets of actual toys we used. Notice that they're very similar. These are Fisher-Price sets with the little people that fit down into the pegs so they can drive the tractor or move around in the barn. They can go down this little ramp roller coaster thing and go on the Ferris wheel or whatever. 1 toy set was used in the baseline. I'm sorry, both toy sets were assessed in baseline, and only 1 toy set was used in intervention. So the other toy set becomes the target for generalization. There's certainly some reasons to believe generalization might be facilitated here because of the similarities between the toys, but there are plenty of different play behaviors that can emerge with either set, right? Like you can't push the roller coaster down on the barn set. There's no cow to milk in the amusement park set, and so forth. So we could teach distinct behaviors with 1 set that shouldn't necessarily generalize to the other set of toys, so that we could look for that both response and stimulus generalization. All right. This is a chaotic mess of a graph, but I'm going to break it down for you in just a second. I just wanted you to see the whole graph here at the beginning so that you can see that it's a multiple baseline with some embedded phases, with some embedded A-B phase here across 3 children, Casey, Vince, and Colt. And we've got a maintenance phase that was at 2, 4, and 6 weeks. Intervention consisted of the stuff that we identified in that first literature review. We had some modeling, least to most prompting, and then contingent reinforcement for functional play skills. We started at a FR1 continuous reinforcement and then faded that over time to an FR3. And then for 2 of the participants, we used lag schedules of reinforcement, wherein there's not a specific behavior that's being targeted for reinforcement, but instead a change in behavior that's being targeted for reinforcement. I'll tell you about that a little bit more as we get into the graph here. The dependent variables included the percentage of intervals in which the child was engaged in stereotypy and functional play. We had our data collectors blinded as to whether or not blinded to the purpose of the study, and also blinded as to whether or not the child was in baseline or intervention when they were coding these videos. We also collected parent report of child indices of happiness. So the parent's opinion when watching videos of their child engaged in baseline or engaged in post-intervention, what did the parents think about the child's happiness, mood, and interest? And also the parents were blinded as to whether or not the video they were observing was pre or post-intervention. All right, so we did all the things we could think of. I don't want to break it down in terms of the single case design quality indicators. All right, here we go. Here's baseline. So this is baseline just for Casey. And we see the triangles here represent a high level of stereotypy, and we have low levels of play. The filled in circles is play with that toy set that's going to be used in intervention, and the open circles are the play set that's going to later be used as the generalization target. One of these sessions here out of the 6 was done in the classroom just to demonstrate that it wasn't as though play only occurred in, maybe the case would be that play would occur in the classroom, but not in this separate room that we pulled the children off to do the baseline assessments in. We pulled the children into this different room to do the baseline assessments because we wanted to look for that generalization across settings, and we wanted to have a room that was never associated with being reinforced in the past, right? So this was literally a closet was a larger closet, bigger than my office, as a matter of fact. But it was a closet that we cleared out of all the stuff. So the children hadn't been in there before. They hadn't played in there before. We used that to avoid any potential learning history associated with that room. So based on this, we implemented intervention, and we get what you expect to see. With prompting, modeling, reinforcement, we see play start to go up, and we get a nice improvement in recognizable play behaviors through the course of this intervention. And we couldn't have been more thrilled to see that even though we weren't interrupting or redirecting or providing any sort of consequence at all for stereotypy, as play increased, we saw stereotypy go down, sort of reiterating the point from our literature review that there seems to be a connection between improving play and a decrease in stereotypic behavior, even when untargeted. So great, we took the child back to baseline, and this is where it got really exciting. Now we're back in that other room where the child has never been reinforced. He wasn't reinforced in baseline. He's not been reinforced in there during the teaching. And we saw continuation of play with the toy set that we used in instruction and generalization to the other play set, right? So this involves different types of play. Again, maybe going down the roller coaster as opposed to milking the cow or something, even though it was untaught. There's no reinforcement maintaining this, and we see the ongoing lower levels of stereotypy than we saw in baseline. 2, 4, 6 weeks of maintenance. Now we still see the higher levels of functional play. We maintain the low levels of stereotypy. There was no intervention between. They went back to doing their typical center time without embedding the play intervention in their rotation. And yet we still have high levels of play with both toy sets. In fact, we have higher levels of play with the toy set that was never used in intervention. So great, Casey did wonderful. Then we go to Vince. Vince has the same initial pattern in baseline, high levels of stereotypy, low levels of functional play with either toy set, both toy sets. We go into the play intervention, and again, we get what we expect to get. The intervention results in an increase in play behavior and a decrease in stereotypy. We get to this point, we think, okay, that's great. We've acquired the play skills. We go back to baseline, remove the reinforcement, any signal of reinforcement. But now, when we take Vince back to baseline, we see a continuation of play with the toy set used in instruction, but the toy set that wasn't used in instruction still remains low. And stereotypy is low when they have access, when the child had access to the play set that they were taught with, but goes back up when they have access to the play set they didn't learn to play with. So from this baseline, we decided to modify our intervention a little bit, and that's where these lag schedules of reinforcement came in. So in a lag schedule of reinforcement, we're not looking for a specific type of play. So for example, if the child rolled the car, it wasn't because we prompted them to roll the car. We didn't say roll the car or model rolling the car. We'd reinforce them, though, because rolling the car met that definition of functional play. If they kept rolling the car, though, they didn't get another reinforcer until they tried something new. In other schedules of reinforcement or in other prompting systems, you might say, all right, let's make the car jump and model a jump or a crash or somebody getting into the car. But that's the behavior analyst suggesting the topography of play to the child. Instead of that, in a lag schedule of reinforcement, we look to see what the child did next, and the next behavior that met the definition of functional play that differed from the previous one, so it wasn't rolling the car, that would get reinforced. So if you alternated 2 appropriate play behaviors on a lag 1 schedule, you'd get reinforcement every time. On a lag 2 schedule, your play behavior has to be different than the preceding 2 behaviors. So you would need at least 3 behaviors that met the definition of functional play for the child to be reinforced. So in this way, you're sort of targeting variability in behavior as opposed to a specific topography of behavior itself. We brought it back into that typical classroom routine, and we used the same toy set that we'd used in the initial intervention, and we built upon our results. This is maintained, or this is in the increasing trend that we saw when the lag schedules were in place and stereotypy maintained at these low levels. But when we go back, not all that different than this first intervention, really, but now when we go back to that baseline setting, we see the generalization across toy sets and the maintained low stereotypy regardless of the toy set in place. So in other words, now we seem to see the response and stimulus generalization. And again, 2, 4, 6 weeks maintenance, higher levels of play are maintained, and low levels of stereotypy are maintained. For the final child, looks a lot like the second child. So Colt, high levels in baseline, low play, taught up the play with one set of toys, brought him back to the baseline setting. We saw generalization across setting, and we saw continuation of play in the absence of reinforcement, but we didn't see play with the untaught set of toys, and stereotypy was only low when given the set of toys the child knew how to play with. Go back to baseline, go back to the lag schedules of reinforcement now, and train up on again on the toy set 1. Now we see the generalization when we go back to baseline, and again, maintained above the original baseline levels. So then we wanted to get at the idea of this playful disposition. We had the parents watch 4 randomly selected videos, 2 videos selected from baseline and 2 videos randomly selected from that final maintenance phase. We shuffled the videos up and showed the video clips to the parents and simply had them fill out 2 rating scales that I found about mood and happiness in existing research. Not a giant fan of Likert-based rating scales where somebody gives a subjective opinion about another individual's internal state. That's a bit dicey at best for behavior analysts. But if anyone knows what that child's mood, happiness, interest level might be, I would contend that it's probably the mom. So we had 3 moms complete these scales, looking at 4 different videos, and then we simply graphed their average ratings here. So for Ashley, we see an increase in mood, happiness, and interest relative to the pre-intervention tapes. Same thing for Vince. Colt's mom saw no particular difference. We see difference in his data, and when asked the follow-up question about, why didn't you, what about this doesn't look like there was change, and those kinds of questions, mom simply said, well, he's still doing some stereotypy, so I don't know if it made much of a difference, even though it does look like he's playing more, was her quote. So whatever the case, Colt doesn't have any changes in his mom's perception of his internal state being playful disposition, but the other 2 participants did. So from that, oh gosh, we're only going to make it through 1 study before I need to open it up to findings, but I'll go real quick here. All 3 children increased in functional play, and we saw a collateral reduction in stereotypy. Play did generalize across settings and toys, and it did not matter that in that generalization setting, when we went back to baseline, there was no potential for reinforcement there. There was no person in that room. There was no signal for reinforcement in that room. The toy set, that's the generalization toy set, had never been reinforced. And play with that set had never been reinforced in the past. This was as absent a learning history of reinforcement as we could create, and yet play maintained. When we didn't see the when we didn't see the generalization that we'd hoped for, it appears that the lag schedules may have facilitated that generalization. I have to be a little bit cautious here because there's only 2 replications. The first child didn't need the lag schedules. He generalized without them. The second 2 appeared to have needed them to support generalization, but a multiple baseline where only 2 legs show the effect is not ideal. So a little bit of caution there on the lag schedules. Play taught using socially mediated reinforcement appears to be maintained by automatic reinforcement in these 3 kids. I think that's an important point. It got to the heart of the criticism of the behavioral approach to teaching play. That this won't happen, it won't occur, it's not genuine play because you're using external reinforcers that subtract from their intrinsic motivation to play. Again, drop my mouse. Again, I'll play with this. I'm sorry, that we don't see those types of things in the absence of play, right? All right. And when it comes to the playful disposition, for no child, it didn't get worse for anyone. And for 2 of the 3 children, their parents at least believe that they are more content, happier, in a better mood, more interested than they were when they were engaged predominantly in stereotypy. So in this way, we seem to have checked off all the boxes, at least to some extent, about the concerns about genuine play and behavioral interventions. I want to show you study 2, but I'm going to go super fast so that we've got some time to talk about this. Hours fly by here. An hour flew by. Play could influence social skills is the idea, right? If you're playing in a way that looks recognizable to other kids, they may come up to you and want to play. If you see other kids doing something that you've learned how to do that you recognize as play, you may be more likely to go up to them. And in this way, you could reduce some social stigmatization. You could increase opportunities to form friendships and whatnot. We wanted to look at the extent to which this actually vetted out. And many of the introductions for the previous research on play interventions, including some of the work we've done, we've written this out, that we believed play would facilitate social opportunities for kids with autism. We thought we'd take a look on a playground. So we had 3 children, very similar to the 3 children that were in the previous study, and a very typical applied setting playground in the context of a summer camp. The playground had all the usual stuff on it: monkey bars, swings, slides, the rest. We measured stereotypy again. We confirmed that it was automatically, we did the best to confirm that we could without doing a functional analysis. We did a QABF to demonstrate that it was likely maintained by automatic reinforcement. We measured play on the playground equipment. So we defined play here on this playground as appropriate use of that equipment. And then we looked at play variability in terms of how many different types of playground equipment the child might use. We also counted it as play if the child participated in a game with other children on the playground. So tag and hide and seek were constantly occurring. If the child with autism engaged in those forms of play, that counted also. They didn't, but it counted. It would have counted. And then we measured the opportunities for social interaction. How many times did other children genuinely come up to the child with autism and seek to play with them? And how many times did the child with autism go off and try to find somebody to play with, and as an opportunity for social interaction? Here's a quick look at the overall design. It's another multiple baseline, this time without all the additional phases in it, staggered across these 3 children. Baseline was simply the absence of intervention on the playground, and we used lag schedules in addition to redirecting stereotypy. When the child engaged in stereotypy, we would say, hey, instead of, we didn't physically interrupt it and physically redirect it. We'd simply say, I see you waving bark in front of your face. Maybe slide down the slide with the bark. Actually, we'd say, is there anything else you could do with the bark? And if the child engaged in a different behavior, then they were on that lag schedule of reinforcement. You have to be careful with a lag schedule that you don't actually prompt the topography you want to see. Instead, you might prompt a change in behavior without suggesting a topography. The first child's data, we saw initially some effort to use the playground equipment on the first day. That decreased over time during baseline, and as the play decreased, the child began engaging in stereotypy. When we implemented the lag schedule of reinforcement intervention here, we saw an immediate increase in play and an immediate decrease in these in the opportunity in the stereotypy, but the opportunities for social interaction for Mac didn't really increase. Same story with Charlie. High stereotypy, high levels of high stereotypy, limited social interaction, some play but not much. The intervention works, we get more play, we get less stereotypy, but it isn't producing this untargeted collateral gain in social interactions. And it didn't for Daryl either. So if we look at variability, we did get the variability. There was more types of playground equipment used in the lag schedules than there were in baseline, and we had higher rates of play in general. The percentage of intervals was higher for play. But what we didn't see was the idea that social interactions would be facilitated simply by teaching play. So from these 2 studies, here's what I take home. We need to do, I think it would benefit behavior analysis to consider adding play skills into instruction and interventions designed to reduce stereotypy. If your goal is to reduce stereotypy, and it might not always be your goal, I think we should allow children with autism to engage in some forms of stereotypy sometimes. We don't need to be overly prescriptive on that, I don't think. But if your goal is to decrease that stereotypy, consider teaching play skills as part of a package to do that. There seems to be an effect there. If you're not seeing generalization in play, from your intervention setting or when reinforcement is removed or to different types of toys, if it doesn't look spontaneous and flexible, consider lag schedules of reinforcement as a component to add to your play intervention. It may have an effect. It is important to note, though, that you can't simply, we did not find evidence that you can simply improve play and expect to see a concomitant improvement in social skills, right? It is probably the case that social skills are going to need to be directly taught. In the case of our playground study, we waited until they were already in this summer camp and accessing this playground to begin our baseline. I wonder if we just started intervention before they started the summer camp, if we might have had better results. Watching that camp take place, the children had already sort of formed routines and set up games and made little friend groups. And by the second week of the thing, the children with autism had already sort of been left out of that kind of stuff. And we wondered, had we have taught the play skills prior to putting them in there on that first day, maybe we would have seen some of the social opportunities that we did not find in this particular study. In terms of future research, I think there's a lot to do. These are small studies. I think we need replication and extensions. We're not the only ones studying play. We're not the only ones using lag schedules of reinforcement to use play. But even if we look at this as a whole, there needs to be more looking at various types of play with larger samples and things. I also question this assumption that play is just automatically maintained, that somehow the standard needs to be that play has to be intrinsically motivated. I think if you look at those taxonomies of play from the developmental psychology literature and from child development literature, they're all based on topographies, what the child's doing. And if they're not that, then they're based on an assumption about the cognitive pretense that underlies play, about the imaginative aspects. And perhaps it is, but we can't see a child imagining. We can only see them engaging in behaviors that we assume means they're imagining, right? I think there's a better way to get at this, and it might be to look at play by function. There's no reason we can't have a functional analysis of play behavior and identify topographies of play for an individual maintained by attention. I think there's some types of play that are maintained by escape. Games you play only when you don't have anything else to do or you don't want to do what you're being asked to do, that kind of thing. And if we align our play interventions with the functional properties of the play we're seeing, we might have better results in our play intervention outcomes. And that concludes what I had prepared to say, a little bit rushed there at the end, but I'm happy to take some questions. Oh, this means, I'm sorry, I ended too soon. There's one more bullet. Play is a behavioral cusp or a pivotal response. This idea that we can create a naturally reinforcing context that we can then embed intervention components to address other things in, I think is really powerful. Like learning to observe and imitate provides a way for you to learn other things. I think learning to play provides a mechanism to acquire additional skills. That's the idea here. All right. I'm going to end sort of abruptly here because I wanted to leave more time for questions than that and just give it back to Devin.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's always interesting to hear about the research you're conducting. I thought the findings you had for that was brilliant, especially the first study where you found that the addition of the lag schedules helped with the stimulus generalization. So that was really interesting. And of course, I loved the inclusion of the mood measures. I
love the appraisal of my work from former students. They're the best audience.
We do have a few minutes. I know we're kind of running out of time, but there were a few questions. Let's see. William asked, is matched stimulation a evidence-based strategy as of when? Would this be going down the same road as sensory integration, and how would this differ?
Oh, I think it's markedly different than sensory integration therapy. I'll refrain from giving my conclusions on sensory integration therapy. This idea of match stimulation, it depends on your definition of evidence-based practice as to whether or not you want to call it an evidence-based practice. But I would direct you to, I don't know if I'm still sharing screen here, but these papers by Lanavaz and colleagues and John Rapp have looked at a lot of match stimulation stuff. John Rapp in particular, I think, is the leader in looking at this. A behavior analyst publishing this work in JAVA, it's worth noting. But what we're doing is saying, what is the reinforcer for stereotypy? If it's not socially mediated, it's not attention or escape or access to some sort of specific tangible or something, then it's very likely automatically maintained. It's occurring in the alone condition. When stereotypy occurs in that alone condition reliably, then we'd say it's automatically maintained. But what does that really mean about its reinforcer? Automatic reinforcement can be positive. I do this because I like the sensory input it provides. Look, you don't have to believe in sensory integration therapy to acknowledge that there are certain types of sensations that are reinforcing, right? And if we can find another way for the child to feel that type of sensation, then we might displace the stereotypy that's functioning to obtain the same type of stimulation. There's a study that I'm familiar with an individual who was engaging in self-injurious behavior. He was striking his own eye. And through a process of figuring out what the likely putative stimulation was, they thought it was likely the lights. The child had a visual impairment that inhibited their ability to see almost everything. But if you impact your eye just right, you can produce these sort of like a sparkle kind of effect, like the cartoon character that gets hit in the head and the stars go around, right? That kind of thing. Well, that was the theory. So then they rigged up a light that was to his hand, and as he moved his hand, it would flash the bright light at his eyes, and that stopped the stereotypy. Whether or not that was actually replacing it with a very similar reinforcer or something else was at play, I don't know. I think there's still some questions about that kind of thing within match stimulation, but I don't think match stimulation is making anywhere near the same kinds of claims that sensory integration therapy is, which is that, you know, doing this is rewiring through neuroplasticity and changing the function of the brain. I don't think it's any of that. I don't think there's much evidence of that. I think instead what we're seeing is typical, I can get the same reinforcer without the pain kind of approach. Does that answer your question?
I think so.
I can't.
He can't respond. I guess he could respond to that. The next question is from Paola. Which type of reinforcer did you use during your intervention?
Oh, I meant to say that. I hate this reinforcer in interventions unless it's specific, unless it's got a good reason. But I used it here for a case. I gave little pieces of candy because it's such a common criticism of behavior analysts that think, you know, this idea that we think the M on the M&M stands for magic and we can change behavior simply by reinforcing everything with candy. First of all, that's a false criticism of behavior analysis. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong. Unless you're teaching MAND for candy, you probably shouldn't use that as a reinforcer. But I used it here specifically because I wanted to show that even when it was that type of reinforcer, if we could do it with that, we could probably do it with a variety of other things. So we would give the small editable. For one child, it ended up being grapes by the end because it was too many M&Ms or something. But we give the small edible to the child and time it with some behavior-specific praise. Great job milking the cow. Here's an M&M, or that kind of thing. And then we faded it out. I do not recommend edible reinforcers to teach play unless you absolutely have no other reinforcers to use, and then you should be looking at conditioning new reinforcers first. But that's what we did here for the sake of demonstration, that we could fade it out and get it to what looked like automatic reinforcement to us.
Okay. And then Mark asked, in intervention 1, did you measure or notice any effects on play-related language from the children? He conducted a similar type of study and found increases in response variability for both play actions and related language that generalized back to the free play area.
I wish we had measured language, and I had it on video, and I could probably still go back and code that, but I didn't initially. I was really wanting to zone in on the stereotypy piece. And another complicating factor was some of the play behaviors came with what sounded a little bit like stereotypy to me. If I'm going, you know, I've got a toy cow and I'm going cow, cow, cow as I engage in my stereotypy, I wasn't sure if I should be coding that as, language. I now see I could have done this in a variety of ways. Could have looked at, different combinations of words, occurrences of words for the first time. But it wasn't a clean dependent variable, and I didn't measure it the first time. But to your point, I do believe that play can produce a situation where language is likely to emerge, and it may have in this study, but I didn't have experimental control over language.
Okay, and I apologize, that was Haley who asked that question. I actually was reading the wrong one.
I knew that was Haley.
Yeah, Haley is there. And then we just have a general comment, I think, from Anton. I guess it's just your perspective on this. Recent research suggests that rocking is stimulated by underactive vestibular system. So activating the vestibular system is more effective than match stimulation. So I guess it's more of
But that would be the same thing, right?
Yeah.
If I put you in a swing, am I not activating your vestibular system? And that actually is kind of my point. And maybe I don't understand that research you're citing to me there, but I think that is match stimulation. The idea is if I'm rocking, perhaps it is because I'm enjoying that vestibular stimulation. Well, if rocking is unusual on the playground, maybe I could instead teach you to use the swing. And if the swing also provides that vestibular stimulation, maybe I'll see a decrease in the amount of time you want to spend rocking and an increase in the amount of time you spend on that swing. I actually think that could be that you're talking about the underlying mechanism that empowers match stimulation, not something different. Does that make sense? No one I can see.
Makes sense, yeah. Okay, well, I think that is all the questions that we have. Unless there's a last minute question someone wants to pop into the question box. But again, thank you so much for coming to do this for us. And yeah, I look forward to future research that you'll be putting out on the topic. And thank you for attending, everybody.
This was great. Thank you all.